Hey, today we're here to talk about the United States entrance into World War II. Um, and I just want you to really get a glimpse into some of the factors that led the United States into war, but more importantly, just to refresh your memory on some of the topics that you might have discussed before in previous classes, and to look at this maybe from the United States entering from a global perspective, not necessarily its own motives, even though we're really going to get into specifics going on in the United States. All right. So when we look at the United States entrance into World War II, we know that the primary um, nation that was the most aggressive towards the United States was Japan. All right. And throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, Japan um, posed the greatest threat to American interest in Asia. All right. And the Stimson Doctrine, of course, after Japan invaded China, um, was authored, and it basically condemned um, the seizure of Manchuria in northeastern China, and it basically was saying that the U.S. would not recognize any international territory changes that were executed by force. All right. There was really no follow up with this doctrine. Nevertheless, it was Japan didn't take it as a threat and continued its pursuits in China, as we know. So, but this predates a lot of the tension that was going on, especially with this open door policy that the U.S. was fully engaged in with that open free trade with China. All right. Um, and basically the open door must be maintained, and that any kind of government or regime changes made in China would curtail any American treaty rights. All right. So in the 1930s, there in America, America took the position of isolationism, and this is a very strong movement. It had a lot of support because a lot of Americans did not, World War One was still fresh in people's minds, and they didn't want to get involved in another European entanglement. All right. And so this was from both political parties, major political parties in Congress, and it lasted really pretty much through 1938. All right, and so Congress is going to adopt these neutrality acts, a series of about three neutrality acts, um, which of course President Roosevelt kind of he knew that it was probably not the best way to stay out of the European involvement, but I guess he kind of looked and understood that this was also going to hurt a lot of American interests when we have all these wars in Europe, or this war going on in Europe. Excuse me. So the Neutrality Act of 1935, it authorized the president to prohibit all shipments and to forbid U.S. citizens to travel on these ships of belligerent nations. So any kind of arms shipment wasn't happening. And 36, extension of loans and credits to any belligerent nation that were at war. And there was a civil war going on in Spain. So the Neutrality Act of 1937 forbade the shipment of arms to the opposing sides in the civil war with Spain. And so isolationists became alarmed at President Roosevelt's pro-British policies. So the America First Committee was formed, and that was basically to warn Americans against the dangers of getting involved in Europe's troubles again. And so they had plenty prominent speakers travel around the world to keep this isolationist um, sentiment up, and to make sure that Americans supported the fact that we should not be involved. All right. So Hitler, of course, is making his moves in Europe, and he invaded Poland, and of course, a series of events thereafter. And many Americans were alarmed by the news, all right, especially of this whole blitzkrieg strategy and how quickly Nazi tanks and planes and the military, they were conquering several countries. All right. Now, nevertheless, many were opposed to these threats and this takeover by Hitler. And of course, you know, Roosevelt believed that British survival was crucial to U.S. security. So, Americans started to concede, and in 1940, most Americans they did accept the need to really amp up the United States defenses because, um, nevertheless, this was still could be potentially a threat to U.S. interests if continued. All right, and so. I mean, he still did not want to give direct aid to Britain because, of course, the neutrality acts that were signed. So we had this cash and carry policy that was going to be um, passed when Roosevelt persuaded Congress to adopt this less restrictive neutrality act, and basically this act said that the U.S. could belligerent nations could buy U.S. arms if it used its own ships, all right, to transport the arms and pay cash. Now, this strongly favored Britain, all right, as of course the British Navy was still the most dominant, all right, in the seas, and of course the Selective Service Act to enforce compulsory military service, all right, between the ages um, of 21 and 35, all right, all American men had to sort of register and trained 1.2 million troops in 1 year, all right. And there was the destroyers for bases, which, of course, Britain was under constant attack by German bomber raids. So these submarine attacks by the Germans it's going to threaten British control of the Atlantic. And of course, Roosevelt arranged a trade which Britain is going to receive some destroyers, all right, and they were older but still serviceable, and this gave also the United States the right to build military bases on the British islands in the Caribbean, okay? So the election of 1940, FDR is going to win by a smaller margin, but he's still going to win his third term, and I guess FDR sort of has some momentum to push for more direct aid to Britain and sort of undermining a little bit these neutrality acts. So he's going to end the cash for carry that permitted Britain to obtain all the U.S. arms it needed on credit. All right. And he sort of made the analogy this is like lending a garden hose to a neighbor to put out a fire. And now, of course, many people are starting to, as this war is continuing, to press towards the British side. And, of course, the Lend-Lease Act was signed into law in March 1941. All right. Roosevelt arranged for a secret meeting with the Atlantic Charter, with the Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Okay, this was a border ship off Newfoundland, and basically, he met with his British Prime Ministers to outline any peace objectives after the war would end. All right, and so what would be the aim? And of course, it was self-determination for all people. They wouldn't seek any territory expansion, and of course, free trade. Now, the main country, the U.S. And Japanese relationship with each other was it had deteriorated since the 1930s, and especially throughout 1940 and 1941. Of course, when Japan was invading China, Japan also had its ambitions to extend to Southeast Asia. So Japan was allied with Italy and Germany in 1940. All right, and this was as a result of Hitler's success in Europe, and this provided Japan an opportunity to seize the Dutch East Indies, British Burma, and French Indochina, and these territories were still held as colonies by European nations. So Japan was sort of seeking its claim on a lot of these Southeast Asian nations that were run by European powers. All right, so Japan joined the Axis, and when Japan did this, Roosevelt sort of responded by prohibiting the export of steel and scrap iron to all countries except Britain, all right, and any nation in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, Japan is going to protest, saying this was an unfriendly act. And in 1941, Japanese troops occupied French Indochina. So as a result, Roosevelt's going to freeze all Japanese credits in the United States, including U.S. oil. Now, both sides did realize that the oil was used to fuel the Navy and the Air Force. So the embargo did not end, and Japan was sort of protest and say it's not fair, and they decided, okay, well, fine, then we're going to extend, and we're going to take the oil resources that are in the Dutch East Indies. All right. Now, of course, when we date back that invasion of China, it sort of violated that open door policy, and Roosevelt said, okay, well, if you want us to end this oil, then you're going to have to pull your troops out of China. And Japan refused to do so. So there's going to be a government change or a new regime in Japan, and Hideki Tojo, who's like the military leader of Japan throughout this time, um, he made a final attempt to negotiate an agreement, but neither side would change his position. All right. Now, Roosevelt's military advisors hoped that an armed confrontation with Japan would be delayed until the U.S. forces were sufficiently strong. However, Japan knew that it had to act quick, and it was due to its limited oil supplies. All right, so we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor. USA was brought into the war by the Japanese attack. Of course, the naval bases in Hawaiian Islands, and of course, the motives for the attack, it was tied up into her economic problems. All right, so when we look at the reasons why Japan sort of invaded, or excuse me, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, um, the government, sort of as you see here, believed that they were run short of raw materials, and they really wanted those territories such as Britain's Malaya and Burma, and they had the rubber, oil, and tin, and towards the Dutch East Indies, which also is rich in oil. So the attack was organized by Yamamoto, and 353 Japanese planes, two were destroyed, 350 aircraft in 2 hours, and 5 battleships, 3,700 men were injured. And of course, Roosevelt called the 7th of December a date which will live in infamy. All right. Now, the significance of Pearl Harbor is that it gave the Japanese control of the Pacific, and by May 1942, they had Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and also American possessions in Guam and Wake Island. And it ultimately caused Hitler to declare war on the U.S. As much as this probably was not his aim, but when he did, it sort of put U.S. troops into the war in Europe also. Um, and he kind of knew that the U.S. would sooner or later declare war on Germany since it was already at war with Japan. All right. Um, so there you have it, my friends. A couple of images from Pearl Harbor.